Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is May 8th, 2026, 1:24 p.m. This post is the first in a series of posts. Or not right now, I'm guessing it'll be three. Um, Relating to the life of the man I call Mr. Professor and our relationship. This is yeah, this has been something that I haven't done before. Um, And in fact, Mr. Professor, his first name was Wayne. I Wayne didn't want to be known publicly, um, for some trying to protect his family, partly trying to protect his family. I mean, Dennis's books, Wayne's identity is all over Dennis's books, but publicly, I won't right now give Wayne's last name till more people die. I outlive him. So, anyway, this is going to be about Wayne and our relationship. And so it was super key to my journey. Can't overemphasize it. In fact, then his involvement with me ruined his life, led to an early death. And it was the greatest sorrow I had on my journey was what happened to Wayne. And this is part of the price that is paid by people. In fact, one of the reasons I keep doing what I do is to carry on for people like Wayne, Brian, etc. So yeah, so Wayne was born on a farm in North Dakota in 1935. Norwegian heritage. I call it the Squarehead migration. I have Scandinavian heritage, and there's this migration from Scandinavia to the Midwest, Minnesota, North Dakota, etc., and then eventually a lot of them moved to the Pacific Northwest. And it was similar to home. And the Indians were gone. So this was yeah, and then like Sweden got completely deforested by the 1850s, I think, and a famine. So anyway, there was a Scandinavian wave of migration, and Wayne's heritage was part of that. So he was born in North Dakota in 35, farming family. Wayne was the oldest of several children, I think oldest of four maybe, and his others, so his younger siblings were all girls. And Wayne's father was an alcoholic. So he was an alcoholic, and Wayne ended up becoming what I call the family hero. In fact, Dennis became the family hero. I became the family hero. Firstborn males. This is a common dynamic. In fact, when Wayne was in the military, like my father was. And Wayne, I remember telling me that he would send his paycheck home to his family to support his family. So he was supporting his family while he was in the military, supporting his family. His father died, I know, a long time ago. I'm not exactly sure when, but the father eventually died. And so Wayne eventually essentially became the family patriarch. Somewhere early on, he became the family patriarch. And Wayne went to college there in North Dakota. I'm not sure it was before or after his army days. I think maybe after his military days. Back in college, he won the state discus throw. Yeah, but told me one day he was just lucky on a windy day. And Wayne, the Minneapolis Lakers were there in Minneapolis, and when he was a kid, I'm talking like 8 years old or something, he actually saw the Lakers barnstorm in the off season. Again, back in those days, they did stuff to make money in the off season. In fact, I lived in my first home. My parents lived in. I lived in California, literally around the block. Literally around the block from us was a guy who was a Major League Baseball player at the time. And in the off season, these guys would drive trucks, this kind of stuff. Yeah, it wasn't a lucrative thing to be a professional athlete back then. Anyway, so the Minneapolis Lakers barnstormed in the off season, and Wayne saw them when he was like 8 years old. He became a lifelong Lakers fan. And so Wayne went to college and became a teacher. got a bachelor's, and I'm not sure what his bachelor's was in, but he eventually became a teacher. In fact, moved to Southern California right around the same time the Lakers moved to Los Angeles. And then Wayne, I remember Wayne taught high school for a year or two while he was earning his master's degree. And then after he got his master's, he got a job teaching accounting at Ventura College, I think in the mid 1960s. And my family moved to Ventura from Houston in 1967 when the Apollo 1 fire drove my father from NASA. And so we both ended up in Ventura around within just a few years of each other. And my collision course with Wayne was set. And as I've written plenty, talked about it, I was in training to become a scientist from the time I could walk, essentially. I was this bookworm, memorized the books my parents read me when I was less than two. Again, I was what they call gifted. I had and I again my company posts links to this, and I published a lot of documents around my life. And so my SAT scores was one proxy for that, where I was when I took the SAT, I had 1 in 1,000 math ability. So 1 in 1,000 people would have my level of ability. Ha! My father's was more like probably 1 in 1,000,000, but 1 in 1,000 was good enough for a career in math and science. So that was my plan. Although, as I've written before, I was also raised in a military household in a militarily dominated community in the world's greatest empire, and I was going to go to the Air Force Academy. Got nominated by my congressman, and my mother saw how war ruined men, and so she prevailed my father to talk me out of going to the Air Force Academy. So then it was like, then what? And so I would, all of my friends were going off to the big universities and stuff, but I was kind of rudderless, maybe you'd say. And so I just went to Ventura College, the local college there, right down just a few miles from my house. And I went there and I started studying a math science curriculum. And I remember my first semester was a rough one. Again, my mother had these bad habits of watching TV and reading tabloids and stuff. I gave her the tabloids when I was 13, and my first semester of college, my wake up call was when I flunked a calculus exam, and I knew something was wrong with this picture. Here I was this math genius, and there I was flunking a calculus exam, and I knew that was like my big wake up call. And so I gave up watching television. I was watching probably 20 or 30 hours a week. And I was raised with that. And I gave it up for a month to see how it worked. And I didn't go back. I didn't watch any TV for like 15 years after that. And my life's direction, so switch gears a little bit here. So when my family changed its diet to whole food from processed food when I was 12, to save my father's health, which resulted in a health miracle. And that was really, I look back, that was really the beginning of my awakening process. That was the first time that I was sort of exposed to something that wasn't just mainstream America. And that was really the beginning of my awakening process. So that was 1970. But the year 1974 was really a watershed year for me. The oil crisis ended the post-war boom in 1974. And the post-war boom was the most prosperous era of the human journey, particularly the United States. We went from the world's richest, most powerful nation. Our standard of living has been declining ever since. And my mentor's engine, the same year, my mentor's engine began making the news as an alternative to internal combustion engines, something that could get 100 miles a gallon. And that summer of 74, my parents sent me to Europe, which was really the beginning of getting culturally awakened, I would say. I was raised kind of as a rube, raised in kind of this racist, bigoted household and stuff. And so that was kind of the beginning of that. But the biggest event that year was at the end of the year when my father had our family take a meditation class and the end of his 40-hour course, which was about 20 hours of lecture and 20 hours of meditation exercises guided with tapes and things to learn to control your brain waves is how it was presented. Well, at the end of the class, I watched people perform what's called a remote viewing, and then I did it. And so, and again, when when the first 10 minutes of this woman, she again, my first employer, this black man named Isaac Brown. Again, in fact, that earlier that year, I worked salvaging the lumber from a walnut farm, and worked there for this black guy, making $1.50 an hour. And I cracked a rib. I injured myself on my first job. And that was the end of my first job. And but that year, but he had diabetes. In fact, he lost, and I've written about this some. I don't know if I've shown it before, but anyway, I remember I have this eidetic memory, so I remember him writing me my paycheck once, and this part of his finger was gone. And I remember watching him write a check, how he could hold a pen with half his index finger gone. Anyway, so when it was time to do these so-called cases, he was my case because he had diabetes, and then actually on that job, I cracked my rib. Well, he actually got a nail in his boot, it went into his foot, but he had diabetes. He didn't have any feeling in his legs, and so he didn't even know that he had a nail in his boot until his foot exploded. He lost half his foot, and anyway, and I think I wrote my little on my little card, this guy, Isaac Brown, age 43, from Ventura, California. And I wrote, I think, diabetes. And anyway, and then and I was a scientific kid. So so a woman went in a meditative state, closed her eyes in a meditative state. And I gave my card to the third guy, who read to her Isaac's name, Isaac Brown, Ventura, California, male, 43 years old. And this woman, and she was just your yuppie woman, probably 25-year-old woman or something. And then she had her eyes closed, and then within a few seconds, she goes, "I have the sense that he's black." And I'm just watching. I don't know what to expect. And then she held up her hand, and she said, "And he's missing the end of this finger." And at that moment, my life was never the same. And yeah. So that was, and, yeah, I don't care what the skeptics have to say. When you have experiences like that, you know. Okay. And so we were doing this like 50 miles away from Ventura. There's no way this woman would have known Isaac Brown, this poor black man from Ventura. And anyway, so I didn't know it at the time, but that wrecked me as a mainstream scientist before my career ever began. In fact, I later on I was given a case to do in my meditative state, and again, feels like you're making it up, but it's like, oh, this woman had a stroke and paralyzed the right side of her body, because I felt what she felt, and the people are like, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's called remote viewing. So anyway, my life was never the same after that, and 5 years later, Brian O'Leary had his scientific career ruined when he had the same experience performing the same exercise in a class called LifeSpring. This was 79 when he had that, which is a cross between Est and Silva. Silva Mind Control is a class where I had that remote reading. And so, and Brian had the same thing. Somebody he'd never known before. Brian described this guy in great detail. Brian thought he knew it was, his intellect thought it was a ridiculous exercise, but when he got done with this exercise, describing this guy, etc., all these things about his life, it was all accurate. And so Brian was never the same after that. So we couldn't drink the Kool-Aid of materialism after that exercise. And I said, ruined Brian's career. He soon left Princeton. I said, as we'll see, my scientific career didn't happen. And so so I went to the local college though, and so I was taking math science. So yeah, in fact, after I flunked the calculus exam, and first semester was a rough one. Well, anyway, the next semester I was back to straight A's, acing calculus, etc. So that was, again, I had adjusted. So it took me a semester to adjust to college. Yeah, that was I remember high school. Junior high school, college, and my first jobs out of college. Those are like my biggest adjustment periods in my lifetime. And And so anyway, so I was back to straight A's. So I was getting straight A's again, chemistry. In fact, chemistry was my first love, along with paleontology, archaeology. And since I was a young boy, this was big with me. And but I was in again my third year of chemistry studies by that time, and I was in my chem lab, and I saw my lab professor walking, between the labs, and I looked at this guy, and in fact, he was probably a little younger than I am today, but this guy was, probably 60 in his 60s and wearing his white lab coat, walking around through these chem labs, and it hit me one day, and I'm like, this is going to be my future. And I really hadn't thought of, I mean, I was seeing the reality now of what a chemistry career might look like. And at that moment, I was like, wait a minute. That was kind of like the first time I really questioned what I was doing. And so, anyway, I thought, well, heck, so I really became rudderless. And for a few months, I became rudderless. I didn't know what to do with my life. And I had the dream, but my energy dreams from my mentor's engine in 74. So this is only 3 years later. This is 77. And after about 3 months again, I had no idea what to do. And in fact, all I knew about as far as academics was you could be a scientist or a mathematician, or you could loaf and be an English major, history major. And that was the extent of my horizons of what I thought, was something I could do. That's how ignorant I was, or be a soldier. And so after I had about 2 months, 2 to 3 months, where I was just really suffering. In fact, I had a girlfriend at the time and stuff, but I was just really suffering as far as what to do with my life. I didn't know. Well, anyway, so after about 3 months of this, one night I went to bed and prayed desperately with all my might, which I'd never done in my life before. Even with the mystical stuff, and I became quite the spirituality student, I had never prayed before. I like that. And I prayed, and I prayed for guidance. I just prayed for guidance, said, please, somebody, I need a clue. I'm all out of ideas. And I fell into a dreamless sleep. And the next morning, when I woke up, opened my eyes, there was an alien voice in my head. Some people actually, and this is not that, I've encountered other instances of this with people. And one thing, the voice doesn't identify itself. Some people actually hear a voice. I didn't hear a voice. It was alien thoughts in my head. But in my first waking thought, this alien thought in my head said, well, why don't you study business? And I remember just like, again, it was an alien thought, and I was instantly enthused, but I'm like, well, that sounds great, but what is it? I actually, so that morning, I actually called my college. I called Ventura College, a counseling department. I said, can you study business in here at this college? And they're like, sure, yeah, come on down. So anyway, later that week, I was meeting with a counselor to start studying business. So I had introduction to business and bookkeeping 101 the next semester. So I basically had abandoned my scientific studies and was then, starting to study business. And I look back and I sort of smile at my attempts to reconcile my spiritual studies, energy dreams, and studying business and capitalism. That was tough to square that, but I was trying. I remember trying to square all that up. Taking philosophy 101, etc. And anyway, so I met with the counselor later that week, and I was starting to take, the business curriculum, and bookkeeping 101. It was just like, again, with my math ability, bookkeeping 101 was like sounded good. As far as I remember the professor said, well, heck, it pays well. I'm like, oh, it pays well. It's math. It's numbers, crunching numbers and stuff, and it pays well. That sounds pretty good. And then I was still studying spiritual stuff at night and working and courting my girlfriend, and I was in track. Like that year, I redshirted. I didn't do track that year, and then I became a vegan. That June of '78, and but that year, I remember it was a fun year for me. I just worked dated my girlfriend, played a lot of basketball. The only year I could dunk a basketball was that year. And then, but my parents divorced there also, an ugly, ugly divorce. And but the next year, I was the skinniest javelin thrower in California at 6 foot 1 inches, like 141 pounds. And but I was working at a retirement home across the street from the college. In fact, my girlfriend lived across the street from the college. Yeah, it was all life was good. Those are some of my happiest years. And looking back, I can see that I was on my way to becoming a comprehensivist, but I didn't see it that way. I was just a learning junkie, so I just love learning. And so, in fact, one of my close friends from childhood once told my father, he said, Wade, he's not a genius, but he's just a really bright kid who likes learning, and that was fair. That was a fair assessment. So yeah, I'm been around a lot of people a lot smarter than me, believe me. But again, back to my racist, bigoted household though. I heard the N-word every day growing up. This was the United States, it wasn't, my household definitely was racist and bigoted, but probably half the houses on my street were also, so this was normal. Yeah, we're the most racist, and as Howard Zinn wrote, in scale, intensity, and duration, the United States is the most racist nation in history. So yeah, that's my great nation. Still dealing with it. Yeah, the echoes are still very loud. Um, so that year of changing from science to business was kind of a wasted academic year for me, right? So I mean, it turned out though, I kind of got lucky, I guess. So my math science curriculum met a bunch of general requirements, so it actually still counted to my degree. And again, I was acing calculus, calculus for scientists and engineers, and then I take business math course, where I basically snored through, and it was like going back to fourth grade for me. Um, and but anyway, so I was studying business, and my girlfriend at the time, who I so wanted to marry, she was applying to go to UC Davis. She was going to be an agriculture major, ag business, and she was going to go to UC. She said she wanted to go to UC Davis, and I was just this puppy dog who would follow her wherever she went. So I said, "Oh, you're going to Davis? I'll go to UC Berkeley. It's nearby. We can still be together." And that was my career planning at the time. So I just go to Berkeley instead. And that was my plan. Actually, I was gonna have to take a year of Spanish, I think, which was like this would be death to me to do that. But I was gonna. If we're gonna, yeah, if I could be close to her. And then well, a couple months later, she said, she's not going to Davis after all. She's going to go to this other ag school called Cal Poly at San Luis Obispo there. Literally a couple hour drive up the coast from where we were in Ventura there. So she decided to go there. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to go there then. And so anyway, so I literally had no idea if they even had a business school. So I was just like going to follow her there. And so yeah, it was usually my first girlfriend. And so we were together about 2 years. And anyway, it turned out that actually Cal Poly had a respected business school. And actually UC, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo was actually the highest ranked state university. There was like got 18 or so Cal State universities at the time, and Cal Poly was considered the best of them. And I had no idea. And so I just was following my girlfriend, and it was in this idyllic setting. And as I look back, this is probably another example of my friends at work guiding my steps, such as they were. So anyway, so then I had a year basically to get in gear to actually be able to take enough classes and stuff in the business curriculum and get my, how to say it, to fill up my transcript with classes, etc., so I could go to Cal Poly. So Cal Poly at that time was actually not that easy to get into. And anyway, so I had a year to catch up. And so I did. So I remember I took 23 units that semester, which is about twice the normal workload. And I remember not sleeping much that semester. And by that time, I actually no longer worked in the restaurant of this retirement community, but I worked as a janitor. In fact, on the same site, so where that walnut farm was for my first job, there was, again, it turned into apartments and stuff, but also turned into the post office and also an office building. And I actually was a janitor of that office building because my close friend, his father was a managing partner of a law firm that owned that building. So I ended up, and again, also just a few blocks away from where my girlfriend was, from where my college was. And all this stuff happened within a stone's throw of each other. In fact, when I eventually married my current wife, she lived literally about 2 blocks away from my old girlfriend. Yeah, it was, again, I look back at that and it was just, I know it was just otherworldly stuff going on that I was kind of oblivious to, but this was my life. So when I took 23 units that semester, and then I remember I didn't sleep a whole lot. That was a busy year. And I was in track and I had a girlfriend, I was working, and then I took Accounting 101 there in the autumn of 1978. And Wayne was the teacher of that. And Accounting 101 was sort of like the beginning of the accounting curriculum. It was a challenging class. They call them washout classes. And so Wayne, in fact, it was like when he would start his lecture, they had a lecture hall there that could seat, 150 people or something. And I think it was pretty typical with Wayne that his first week he'd be lecturing to a full lecture hall, and by the end of the semester, it was half full kind of thing. It was a washout. It was a challenging class, and it separated the dabblers from people who are really serious about pursuing an accounting career. And Wayne, he changed lives as a professor. He was the best professor I ever had. He was also the most beloved professor on campus. So this was, again, this North Dakota farm boy personality and stuff. He was just, again, I've been charmed. I've had the good fortune to know other Midwest farmers, and it's a thing where there's a certain charm about them, a certain naivete, if you will, honesty, this kind of thing. Wayne was one of those, and at the campus, like, he provided free taxes, so he was a tax guy. He actually was a partner. He was a partner in an accounting firm also there. So during the busy season, during the winter months, he was working 70 hours a week himself, teaching school and then doing tax returns in the wintertime. And so, but when he was on campus, he gave free tax advice to any faculty who wanted it. And with the coming ordeal here in Ventura, I heard, in fact, my wife, her ex brother-in-law who used to live with her, Wayne changed his life, turned his life around. He was rudderless until he took Accounting 101 from Wayne. The guy ended up having an accounting career because of Wayne. And this is, Wayne was that kind of professor. He believed in his students, he cared. And so Wayne was he was a one-off. Man was a saint. Yeah, in fact, another one of my wife's friends, professor there, she got sick, and then Wayne actually had his daughter come over and be her maid for a while, free, right? Just he sent his daughter over to take care of one of his fellow professors who was ill for weeks, as I recall. And this was Wayne, and this was just stuff I'd heard of like randomly. Yeah, so he was a saint, and he was revered and beloved on campus. Yeah, he was a true pillar of the community. And me, so I was, again, with my math ability, my learning junkie, etc., my zeal for learning was fully brought to bear on my accounting studies in that class. And in fact, so in my academic career, the hardest classes were my favorites. They're the ones that really challenge you and stuff. Those are my favorite classes because they were, you really got something out of it. You really, it was again, I could feel myself working my mental muscles as I was able to take these classes. And so I was one of Wayne's most memorable students. So I was like one of the best students he ever had. And then I went off to university. And my girlfriend and I, when we went off to Cal Poly, we were actually assigned to the same dorm building. And so it was like 3 stories, and I was on the 3rd floor and she was on the 2nd floor. And then Yeah, and then I got a roommate, a guy named Robert. In fact, we became friends for life because he died here a couple back in 2024, which I've linked to this, and I think he was killed by the COVID vaccine, gave him brain cancer. And in fact, Robert was a junior college transfer like I was. Basically talked him and another future roommate, my only surviving one, into studying accounting rather than maybe finance. And but the week after we got there, my girlfriend dumped me. That was a very trying year emotionally. And I just threw myself into my studies. And then my first intermediate accounting was the washout class, upper level business. That was a big washout class. And then during the first month of class there, the professor gave us a test, which was actually a national accounting test, giving to students who were beginning their upper class classes, and it was a class on basically how much accounting had you learned so far, and I scored the highest score at the college at the university among of that year, which again my professor said what the highest score was, and it was mine, and so 98th percentile nationally. And so in fact, I eventually became the tutor and paper grader for the department head. Yeah, I was a superstar student. And in fact, just before I graduated, again, the same thing, just before you graduate, there's another national accounting exam you give. I think it's called level 2 or AICPA level 2. And I took that test as again, I was giving it to in my class. I was in an accounting theory class, and I scored the highest score in the history of the university. So I was record-setting student, going to do great things, haha. And yeah, but that first year, in fact, that was my peak athletic year. I guess as a javelin thrower. I started training. In fact, I was a vegan, so I couldn't be a vegan and be an all-American javelin thrower. And so I started eating 6 eggs a week in weight training, gained like 20 pounds of muscle in about 2 months. But my friends had other ideas for me. I got an elbow injury, and that was kind of beginning of the end of my athletic career. I could have been like Olympic trials level javelin thrower. I had the ability to do that, but also I realized, and I saw guys. I've competed against guys who were, world record holders, this kind of stuff, and I saw there was a job. So if you want to compete at the global level, it was your full time job. And I had too much going on to devote several hours a day to training, so I didn't. So but it was fun. So I was going to school and it wasn't working. So I actually saved up some money in my early years in Ventura there that I didn't have to work that first year. But then long story, but I ran out of money, had to go to work again eventually as a fry cook at a restaurant eventually. I had to get a student loan, but I got out. And then I got out of school. In the worst recession in 40 years. So I got out of school in December of 81. And I was just burned out from college. I was burned out by the academia. Yeah, I mean, the best class, again, the hardest classes were my favorites, but a lot of classes were just worthless. And I actually didn't do well in the worthless classes. I refused to memorize trivia and stuff. And so, and in Los Angeles, so the big international accounting firms were rolling out the red carpet for me in LA, but I didn't want to live there. Again, LA was this terrible. I grew up within an hour of Los Angeles, and it was a terrible place you only went to if you had to go to a Dodger game or the airport was the only time I'd go down there. And I want to live in Seattle. And my uncle introduced me to hiking in the mountains several years earlier, and I was hooked. And so I wanted to move back to Seattle. In fact, looking back over the years, I realized that within months of my girlfriend dumping me, I started thinking about moving to Seattle on graduation. So anyway, and then so I did move to Seattle, but yeah, it was like 19% unemployment in the Seattle area at that time. And I actually crawled back down to Los Angeles after a brief stint as working for an accounting firm doing tax returns, which I thought I'd never do when I was in school, but there I was doing them right out of college. And I crawled back down to Southern California. I lived with my mother for like 6 months there in Ventura before I began my career in Los Angeles. And in fact, I worked as a clerk at the new county center, which is only a few miles again from where I was raised. And soon before I moved to Los Angeles, and again, my memory is failing me a little bit exactly when I saw him, but I think it was then that I went to his house and saw him, hung out with him. I hung out with Wayne in his home, and that was memorable. And then I ran into him in town one day, same time as I recall, same stint. And he told me about an investment opportunity in this new life insurance company that was taking on the industry and stuff. And I didn't have any money to do that, but anyway, but Wayne's tip was a hot one. It was A.L. Williams Insurance Company, and Wayne became a millionaire from investing in that life insurance company. And A.L. Williams, long story, I've written about it a bit, where he took on a corrupt life insurance industry that was basically screwing its customers. And so he came up with a way to truly get true life insurance instead of all the other stuff that life insurance companies have put into it, investments that which was mostly a scam. And so, in fact, the funny thing is the next year, when I began my career in Los Angeles, I consulted my accounting firm. I consulted at that insurance company the next year. But, I was working in Los Angeles. Again, Los Angeles was hell. I spent several months in Skid Row, and I've written about this. I've talked about this, I believe. So it was a super shock for me to working in Los Angeles. I've been working in LA, and as I said, the epitome of that was I was walking to lunch one day and I had to step over a dead body on the sidewalk, and that was life in Skid Row. And in fact, after a year, so my second year, so a little over a year of being there, actually during the busy season, I'm working 70-hour weeks and stuff. I started having stress problems. I didn't know what they were at the time. In fact, out of college, I also had a headache every waking hour for the time I was at the small CPA firm in Seattle. So this was different stress problems, and I couldn't get a full lung of air. And I had tingling. Anyway, it was classic stress problems, stress symptoms. As I mentioned, the lifestyle was so terrible to be an accountant there. I mean, it was just a terrible lifestyle. In fact, people were going gray in their 20s. And in fact, I never heard of a partner in one of those firms lived to be 70. The lifestyle was that, they work 60 hours a week. They're drinking at cocktail parties 3 days a week they're eating all their foods all their meals are at restaurants, no exercise. Yeah. And none of them make it to 70. In fact, mandatory retirement was 55. And I knew a guy who retired at 55 and he looked like he was 75. And again, they forced me to eat meat and drink alcohol for my job. This was part of grooming you, for your career. It was killing me. Yeah, I was definitely a fish out of the water. And again, I left home kind of as a rube. It took me years to put that racist and bigoted upbringing behind me. And so, my roommates in Cal Poly started calling me on that. And I was like, yeah, what barn were you raised in, boy? And so anyway, so it took a while for me to put that stuff behind. I started putting behind me immediately, but it was a thing but I was really kind of left home as a rube. And so I was kind of a rube there in the big city. Kind of, sort of. I mean, it didn't matter how smart I was kind of a rube. And I worked there, though, 3 years. I worked 3 years at this company. And in fact, and I've written about this a lot, where my last 2 winters there, I worked on what used to be the world's biggest savings and loan. And anyway, it was in the early innings of what became called the savings and loan scandal. And when I was there only a month on this engagement, the partner who ran the engagement, which was this huge exposure engagement, national news kind of engagement, he basically said that, the previous auditor signed off on phony financial statements, but we probably would have also. And I didn't get it at the time, but I eventually realized that when it became a scandal that all the big savings and loan companies were cooking their books, and the auditors were signing off on these phony financial statements because there's a conflict of interest where the companies hire their own auditors. You can't render an independent opinion when the company's hiring you to give an opinion on them. Duh. But that is, again, these conflicts of interest that are just so normalized. And so this was something that I didn't get it at first. It took me a while. In fact, I've done this before. I'll be very brief, but after my first season, after my first busy season there in LA, I was able to ask a question in my first class that I had there, which was, how does what we're doing benefit society? Which is what you're told in the first day of accounting class or auditing class. But I need to hear it again. And everybody laughed at my question. It was like, everybody wanted to know how much the partners made. They didn't want to hear about, how if we benefit society or not, because we're told in the first day is like, you benefit society because you provide this, you're like financial police, except you can't be financial police when the criminals are paying you to be a police. Yeah, we were cops on the take. Still that way. So these are the main conflicts of interest. This is my first real example, real world experience there of how conflicts of interest corrupt things. And so in the world of scarcity and fear, everything becomes corrupt. And so, anyways, this was how it is. So anyway, so after I was there 3 years, a little over 3 years, and the stress symptoms didn't go away the next busy season. So I was like, for over about a year and a half, I was in serious stress. I was drinking. I had a drinking problem. I was a wreck, total wreck. And I was 27. And anyway, yeah, I felt trapped in an urban hell. I wasn't going to get promoted. I was sort of like this lost way from the office, and I was in a profession that I wasn't sure I believed in, and I felt trapped. In fact, I had tried 3 times to move to Seattle. Once during college, once right after college, and then the year before, during my vacation, I went up to Seattle and tried to look for work again. I didn't have enough experience for them to hire me at a CPA firm. One that I interviewed at right out of college. And anyway, it came to a head one day when I was going to leave the firm, and I went to bed. And for the second and so far last time in my life, I prayed for guidance, just like I did the first time, 7 or 8 years earlier. I just said, please, I'm all out of ideas. I don't know what to do. Give me an idea. And the next morning, it wasn't as dramatic as it was 8 years earlier. It was my first waking thought, but somehow in the first half hour or so of being awake, this voice started chattering in my mind, like, move to Seattle now. What do you got to lose? And so I was instantly enthused. And that was on a Tuesday. And by Saturday, I was actually driving up to Seattle. And the next Friday, I was interviewing at Dennis's lease company. I still have a hard time believing that happened. And again, when my grandmother told me, when this recruiter told me to be ready for an interview at a solar company, it felt like a lightning bolt hit me. And over 40 years later, that lightning bolt is still reverberating in my life. And yeah. And so then I met Dennis. And then my wild ride began. And again, I've written about this, discussed this on a very, very short version, is that, Dennis was putting the world's best heating system on people's homes for free. And it turned out to be too much of a threat to, at that time, it was the electric industry in Washington State. And so they pulled in all their favors and wiped the company out. And I was there to watch the final death throes of that company. And then I watched it get stolen, engineered by my boss. Watched Dennis's company get stolen. So Dennis went from a net worth of $50 million to zero in a year. And yeah, that's how crazy Dennis's journey has been. And so the lightning bolt hit me. And so Dennis was running out of the state. Literally, less than 3 months after I met Dennis was running out of the state. And so I couldn't, again, my childhood dreams of changing the industry and everything. It was just like, yeah, I was going to get to chase this dream. I couldn't let it go. And so Dennis couldn't get rid of me. So in fact, he tried to talk me out of chasing the Boston, but I eventually said, Dennis, I need to do this. So he let me. I chased out the Boston and helped him rebuild. And I got there in November of 1986 in Boston. And And then Dennis and I, again, Dennis was living with the family of one of the salesmen who got the family involved, which ruined them. They went bankrupt because of their involvement. Um, and they didn't get it either in ways. But I remember sending Christmas cards to people. That was again Christmas cards to people that winter. I was so full of fire with what I was doing there. And one of the Christmas cards was to Wayne, to just let him tell him what his crazy student was trying to change the world out there in Boston. And in mid-January, so yeah, in early December of '86, I started fasting because it was cheaper than eating. Yeah, so I could drink a gallon of apple juice a day for $2.25, and it was cheaper than eating. So it was on my lifetime's longest fast. It was a 45-day fast, just drinking apple juice for 45 days. Till my heart started fibrillating, I had to stop. Uh, and again, I've written about this. I don't ever talked about it. Where basically what happened was that I moved with Dennis and his family to a home, to a house. They couldn't take living at that house anymore. The family, the salesman, and and Dennis had an investor, and Dennis didn't tell me at the time this investor was going to put up $1 million. All I heard was the 20,000 down payment that Dennis was going to get. And then when the guy reneged on that, and we were high and dry in this house, about to become homeless, and and as I started understanding, because I just want to help Dennis rebuild. I hadn't dreamed of being an owner in this. I mean, literally, actually in Seattle, I worked for free for months. In fact, for a while there, Dennis promised me stock to keep working for him. So, and this was like, and I was gonna get maybe 1/zillionth of 1% or something of the company. I was happy with that. Well, here I was, a chance to become Dennis's partner, when I realized that this guy, and again, Dennis didn't tell me that the guy was going to put up $1 million. All I knew was the 20,000 he was going to put up to start it off. And when he reneged on that, then we were high and dry. And I was working for the Kennedys at the time as an accounts payable clerk at their foundation for disabled children. I was ready to keep working just to keep so we could pay the rent, this kind of thing. And anyway, and then Dennis, that morning when he told me I need to keep working, I started asking more particulars about what had happened. And when he told me what had happened, and after thinking about it a couple of hours, I said, Dennis, if I come up with 20,000, can I be your partner? And in fact, Dennis wrote in his books, it was divine intervention. And he says, sure. And so by that was on Saturday. By Monday morning, $25,000 was heading to my bank account for my family and friends. And Dennis, that was an amazing moment. And then what happened was when I raised this money, I wasn't going to take any for myself. It was just I was going to manage my friends who are going to become zillionaires because of this. And that's how naive I was. And so Dennis said, "Wade, give yourself 20% of that company." So I did. So I gave myself 20%, but then I gave away 10% of my share to family and friends. So we all go on the Good Disrupt Lollipop together. And well, anyway, next thing I know, because I was giving giving shares to my family and friends, they started telling people. Then all of a sudden, people started contacting me, wanting to get in. So this next wave of investors wanted to show up, and we could have used the money. And so anyway, so then I was like, okay, I guess I'll take your money. I doubled the price for them over the founders, but yeah, we were just trying to get this greatest energy show on earth on the road, getting it going. Well, anyway, after I had done that, so this is now probably in end of January of 1987, early February, something like that. I got a reply from Wayne. I got a letter from Wayne to my Christmas card. And my Christmas card, I didn't say I was fasting, it was cheaper than eating. I just said, you're crazy students trying to change the world. Well, anyway, I got a letter from Wayne, and in the envelope was a check for $1,000. And that was Merry Christmas from Wayne. Yeah, that was Wayne, St. Wayne. He just gave me $1,000. He just gave one of his favorite students $1,000. Just just Merry Christmas. So when I saw that, and again, I already had all these people beating my door down to invest, I would not let Wayne's magnanimous gesture go to waste. And I said, well, you're now part of my second wave of investors. So Wayne, I said, Wayne, I'm giving you stock for that. So thank you for the gift, but I'm just going to make a stock in the company. Well, that gesture of mine ultimately ruined and shortened Wayne's life. And so this was, yeah. So out of the best of intentions on both sides, this became, that event began the ruination and early ending of Wayne's life. And so that story will come next. So that's all for today. It takes a lot out of me to tell this story.